Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to my read-along of Anthony Trollope's great novel, The Way We Live Now. I'm reading this with booktuber Jordan Parsons and his adorable rats. And we are blocking this thing off in 4 parts for the month of October, so we're gearing up. We're in the third block of 25 chapters. And this is the story of a degraded world. A decadent, degraded world. There are the boys from the Bear Garden. A horrible, disreputable London club that only opens in the afternoon because it's assumed that all of its ne'er-do-well members will be hung over until then. And that it won't have any real old members except the most thoroughly corrupt wastrels that the city has to offer. But it isn't just at the Bear Garden that we get wastrels. They go all the way to the top. The main character in this book, for all intents and purposes, is Augustus Melmotte, a corrupt, swindling financier who has convinced everyone that he is really, really rich, that he's a billionaire, and that he would prove it to them if only his taxes weren't under audit. He takes London by storm, and as is the case with such men, he becomes a litmus test for all kinds of people. Will they accept bootlicking humiliation from him on the chance of riding his coattails to slightly more wealth or prominence than they already have, or will they call him out for the obvious scab that he is? That moral divide runs through this book, and far too few people show up on the right side of it. Most people in this book, no matter what they think of Mr. Melmotte, are out for their own. There's a love story, a contorted love story in here. Two people who are kind of sort of meant for each other. Actually, two pairs of people, two pairs of young lovers who are kind of sort of meant for each other. But the main thrust of the book, especially in the chapters that we're reading today, is the fall of Augustus Melmotte. Because if you are a corrupt financier, in all previous generations, I'm not talking about the 21st century. The 21st century is completely different and entirely insane. But in all previous centuries, these figures show up all throughout history. And whenever they do, the thing that is fatal to them is incontrovertible proof that they are a fraud. If that happens, or even the rumor of it starts to spread, then the house of cards starts tumbling right away. Then all of a sudden, all of the merchants in the city who've been supplying your big house with its meals, with its food, with its laundry, with its newly pressed dresses and all of that, with its groundskeeping. Suddenly, all of those people who haven't yet been paid, but have just been complacently assuming that they will be paid, start to wonder, maybe I should send a guy around and ask about our bill. Not to be importune or anything, but maybe you could settle this bill. You get one person who has that attitude, and you might be able to do it. We know that Melmotte has some spending money. You get 30 people who are willing to do that, including for large sums of money, and you're out. You're done because you are not what you say you are. In the 21st century, completely drop-dead obvious videotaped footage of fraud is not enough to burst that bubble. But in all other centuries it was, and that's exactly what we see really starting to come to a head in these chapters. In these chapters, Melmotte is on the verge of giving what ought to be the triumphant period of his life. He is giving a dinner and a ball, or a meeting afterwards, for the Emperor of China, a huge event that all of London wanted tickets to. And he's also standing for Parliament, and is a shoo-in to be a member of Parliament. At which point he believes that the combination of that social prominence and that political prominence will make him completely untouchable. He's right on the edge of that when rumor starts to spread that he is a fraud. And that anyone who's connected with him is going to crash right along with him. Rumor even goes so far as to say that he might be arrested at any minute. This is drastically horrible for Mr. Melmotte. And the pebble that starts the avalanche is the least likely thing in the world. One of the besotted young men from the Bear Garden is a character named Dolly Longstaff. He's the ne'er-do-well alcoholic son of a ne'er-do-well, extremely embarrassed, wealthy family, a prominent family that has no liquid wealth at all. They do have land. They do have properties. Dolly Longstaff is a fool. He's a nitwit. He admits that himself. But he cares about his money. He cares about what's his. To the extent where he's never bowed even to the will of his father. to help make some of that money, or maybe some of the rights to that property, to sign some of that away to his father, whose own properties are deeply indebted. But Mr. Melmotte works a magic on the Longstaffs to get them to cooperate on the sale of one of their properties, Pickering Park, the money from which will disembarrass the elder Mr. Longstaff's property and also disembarrass Dolly Longstaff's property, which he holds separate from his father. In other words, as I mentioned last time, the Longstaffs have need of cash. They have need of ready money. It is absolutely no good to them how big Mr. Melmotte's reputation is. They don't care about his reputation at all. The elder Longstaff does. Dolly Longstaff doesn't care about reputations at all. He wants his money. And the Longstaff, the centuries-long Longstaff law firm is a sleepy, very slow place that really, they observe the forms. They're very, very courteous. They're not going to push Mr. Melmotte. They will remind him courteously from time to time that although Melmotte has taken possession of the property, and although a city informant tells Mr. Longstaff that Melmotte no sooner got his hands on the property than he refinanced it, he remortgaged it for his own purposes. As the friend tells Mr. Longstaff, that is a sign of desperation. No one would ordinarily do that. That even though all that has happened, no money has actually come to the Longstaffs. It's all been promises. It's all been, well, I will take up your debt, but your debt is still there, and you haven't seen any money from the proceeds of this sale. That is increasingly uncomfortable for the elder Mr. Longstaff and completely unacceptable for the younger Mr. Longstaff, who engages with a separate lawyer. A lawyer who is not part of that somnolent firm, but instead is a ruffian, a nobody in the law, but who is a terrier. He goes after anybody. He doesn't care about deference to wealth or property or title. We're told that he has often been right at the elbow of property younger sons, making sure they know exactly how much is coming to them, whereas they might once have, with an elderly law firm, they might once have just squandered it all in ignorance. And the whole of the subject, this particular crack in Mr. Melmotte's facade, boils down to a signature on a document. And even Dolly Longstaff's own private lawyer, the bulldog, the terrier, is convinced that Dolly Longstaff could be made to sign anything when he's drunk, which he's drunk every night. But Dolly Longstaff tells him, no, that did not happen. I admit that I'm drunk every night. I admit I love brandy and water as much as anyone. I admit I'm a nitwit. But I would never, under any circumstances, sign anything like that. I would not sign away what's mine. And he convinces his lawyer, and it turns out it's true. All of a sudden. But, in a way, the thing that Trollope is so good at conveying in these chapters is that in a way it doesn't matter whether or not it's actually true. Rumor starts to associate the word forgery with Melmotte's name. There's nothing Melmotte can do about it. When his dinner for the Emperor of China actually happens, he's aghast to notice how many empty seats there are. London is already starting to distance itself from him, merely on the strength of rumor. No one knows anything. But they come to know things. In the course of this book, they come to know things. And it's brutal. It further lays bare how brutal a world Trollope is writing about in this book. It's brutal to everybody. It starts off brutal with Henrietta Carberry, with the character we meet at the beginning, but she is largely dropped for huge sections of this book. It's brutal for everybody. There are sharks, and there are the fish that shark eat, and that's all. With a couple of very noble exceptions that don't enter into the plot all that much. There's one perfect paragon character who's pretty clearly a stand-in for Trollope. But other than that, no. And one of the characters who's caught up in that brutal world, there are two young women. I mean, there are 5 prominent young women in this book, but 2 young women really are plugging at my heartstrings this time around for different reasons, but mainly for the reason I mentioned last week, which is that Trollope doesn't make them likable. He exposes them to the worst grinding gears of this cruel world that he has laid bare, but he doesn't make them likable in the process. One is Marie Melmotte, Mr. Melmotte's only daughter, his only heir, on whom years ago he settled on a large amount of money that was legally hers, so his debtors couldn't get at it. He did it as an insurance policy. It never occurred to him that Marie would be anything other than an extension of his own will. So he assumed that if worse came to worse and the walls came tumbling down, he would still have access to this money because he would get her to sign the appropriate papers over to him. And also the other of those two unlikable young women is Georgiana Longstaff, Dolly Longstaff's sister, who came out to society 10 years ago with all kinds of airs and graces, thinking, well, now that I'm a debutante, now that I'm out in the world, I will expect dukes to come and pay court. The whole purpose of a young lady coming out to society was to find a husband, an establishment of her own, a household of her own, so that she is not dependent on her parents forever. Georgiana Longstaff mentions in the chapters that we're reading today how horrifying the prospect is of her being just a forever dependent on her parents, and then once her parents are dead, dependent on Dolly Longstaff for just a room or a little meal here and there with nothing to say about it, just a non-entity. Brutal as a practice. As the years go on, and she realizes that either she has been too haughty and too dismissive, which we get the strong impression is the case, or that the men just aren't suitable, one way or another, as the years goes on, Georgiana Longstaff slowly revises what she's expecting from her suitors. It doesn't help. They still don't show up. Her estimates are always too high for her value. She is a tedious person. She's not all that physically attractive. Her family is deeply embarrassed and also cloddish and not very likable. They have impressive properties, but anyone who spends any time with them is not going to want to be part of that family. To the point where now it's been 10 years, and she is in London as a guest of the Melmots, a family she despises for being, carpetbagging, nouveau-riche people who aren't part of her family set at all. All of her friends despise them as well, although they're perfectly happy to elbow themselves out of the way to get to that ball. And in the chapters that we're reading today, Georgiana Longstaff decides to take an offer from an elderly Jewish businessman, Ezekiel Bregert, that will make her his wife. She would have to get married. The marriage would have to be held at the Melmott's house. Her own family, at the family estate back in the country, won't have a Jewish man, his Jewish city financier friends. They won't know her anymore after this marriage. That's pretty much what she knows, is that her family won't know her. But it's better in her mind to have that than to have nothing. And it's awkward reading, not just because it's brutal without any hint of morality, without any hint of relief. You feel sorry for Marie Melmotte and Georgiana Longstaff, but you don't ever feel sympathy for them. That's a weird feeling. It takes a lot of skill to do that, I might point out. I know that, once again, Jordan in his video gave that line that just burns like salt, where he said, I was reading this book and once again was thinking of Dickens. I want you to stop thinking about Dickens when you're reading an incalculably better author, but apparently that's not going to happen. But it takes a lot of skill to do that, to make you feel sorry for characters without feeling sympathy for them. And that happens with a lot of characters in this book. I might go so far as to say it even happens with Felix Carberry, the horrible young sodded baronet who has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. In any case, the chapters about where Georgiana is settling for Ezekiel Bregert aren't just hard to read because of that brutality. They're also hard to read because they are, more than almost any other chapter in any other major novel by Anthony Trollope, they really do lay bare anti-Semitism. And they make it impossible, even for someone who loves Trollope as much as I do, they make it impossible to take the standard approach of saying that he is merely reflecting the anti-Semitism of the day rather than participating in it himself. The chapters, there's one in particular chapter with Georgiana Longstaff talking about the prospect of marrying a Jew. And her old school friend, Julia Triplex, who's married now to Sir Damask Monogram, she's part of the establishment, she's even more forthright about the horror of that. And she knows people who are even more forthright than she is. Those chapters make it impossible to continue the argument, the dodge, that Trollope himself was not anti-Semitic. And that makes me tremble for this book. It's an ugly note, in this book. I'm not a child, so I don't dismiss the book because of the ugly note. I don't have to like the author to love the book. But nevertheless, children do rule the world of reading in the 21st century. I might not be a child, but children do run things. People with childish attitudes do run things. And as soon as those people learn about that chapter, it's way too far in on a long novel. So they haven't learned about it yet. But once they learn about that aspect of this book, no one will be allowed to read it anymore. It'll never be taught. No publisher will ever reprint it. It makes me sad, very sad. And in a couple of different ways. Of course, rereading those chapters makes me sad because you always hope, Trollope is such a personable narrator on the page, that you always hope they're not going to show any disgusting bigotries. You always hope you're going to be able to root for the author of the book, regardless of whether or not you root for any of the characters in the book. And these chapters make that impossible. Even though in the chapters themselves, there's a great deal of friendly admiration for the Jewish people, it's impossible to extricate it from the anti-Semitism that goes along with it, and not just on the part of the characters. And that makes me sad, rereading those chapters, because it's definitely there. There's no way around it. You can still enjoy this novel. I love it. I'm loving it more rereading it now than I have ever before. But there's no way to avoid seeing it. It is definitely there. That part makes me sad, but it also makes me sad that this book is absolutely targeted for cancellation. There's no way around it. We shall see. Maybe it will fly under the radar. Trollope has done for 100 years a really good job of flying under the radar of a lot of bookish people and non-bookish people, censors of all kinds. Maybe that will be the case here. And I guess in a redeeming way, maybe Ezekiel Bregart is a nice guy. No one has a negative word to say about him unless they're just saying that he's a Jew. I don't know. I don't know. I thought I would mention it in case some of you were doing this read-along and haven't quite got to those chapters. You are going to see that, and there's no way around it. The one consolation that I take, and I was rereading this 2 nights ago, those chapters, and actually thought this to myself, just, in the little book room. The one consolation that I take when I think about that is that by some miracle, I don't know how it happened, but by some, especially on YouTube, of all places, but by some miracle, this little corner of BookTube seems to have gathered together the adults in the room, even when some of the people some of those adults are actually children. We seem to be a coterie of people who understand that reading is nuanced, that reading is complicated, that you can hate things about the author and still like their book. We seem to understand lots and lots of stuff that absolutely they do not understand on Book Twitter. They absolutely do not understand it on Bookstagram, most of Bookstagram. They certainly don't understand it on YA Goodreads. Oh my God, think about those vast crowds. You might think, off the top of your head, that the body of people out there online that is most antithetical to you would be non-readers, but no, you can talk to non-readers about how great the Hawkeyes are. You can't talk to those people at all. They have weaponized books to shoulder up their own prejudices, to shoulder up their own desire to censor and control other people. They're using books to do that. Think about, well, maybe you're not aware of YA Goodreads. If you're not, you shouldn't be. Good for you. But the one consolation I took when I was rereading those chapters, that thread running through these chapters of this book, was knowing that if you are doing this read-along, I can trust you. I guess is the dumb way to say it. I can trust you that you'll get to that and just take it in your stride. You take the good with the bad in any great book. But it does, I want to stress it, I'll wrap up, I want to stress that aspect of it because that aspect of it is an undeniable part of the downfall of Mr. Melmotte. The downfall of Mr. Melmotte starts to take on very Merchant of Venice tones. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there was a very booming subgenre of literature that could basically be boiled down to the Jews' comeuppance. It was entirely hypocritical from the beginning. The people who were writing these things were all Gentiles who were greedy up to their eyeballs. So getting all sorts of narrative juice out of watching a greedy person get their comeuppance is pretty hypocritical when you are just as greedy or more so. And its hands are no cleaner. in the Victorian era either. But that informs a lot of the dramatic engine work of the final 25 chapters of this book, which I might point out, speaking of Merchant of Venice, it's tremendously effectively done. Even though you know that it comes from a really soiling place, a place that you wish didn't exist. We'll talk about it again next week. I promise I won't dwell on it exclusively. I just wanted to mention it here because it's unavoidable in these chapters. It has been avoidable up until now. People up until now in Way We Live Now have mostly referred to Melmotte as a swindler, as a horrible con artist, as someone who everybody knows isn't on the up and up. Everybody knows he's not being audited. Everybody knows he's not a billionaire. And they play along with it anyway to get the most out of him. It brings out the worst in everybody. But up until here, usually that kind of anti-Semitism is directed at Mrs. Melmotte and not at Mr. Melmotte, and not at a broader class of greedy city merchantmen. When Julia Triplex, when Lady Monogram says these people in reference to Ezekiel Bregart, she's also referring to Melmotte, and she's referring to Jews, not city financiers. If city financiers who want to swindle people out of their money could easily apply to people like Hamilton Fisker. We see in the course of this novel that they're not, the Jewish characters are not the only people who are greedy. So it's a messy subject. The only thing I wanted to warn you about is that mess is coming. If you haven't reached it already, you're going to. But again, I take consolation in the fact that we can handle messes, especially if there's great stuff to go along with it, and there is a great lot of stuff in this book. So we're going to finish up next week. We're going to finish up on what will certainly be my only Trollope read-along of this year. So we'll finish up with The Way We Live Now next week, when I will try to give a broader picture instead of just warning you about this one icky element of the book. There's a lot of great stuff here. Trollope does a great job of portraying the slow, partial destruction, the way little seeps and seams start to find their way into the scheme of all schemes, Augustus Melmotte. He is 100% sure that he has covered himself. And even in the chapters that we're reading today, he's still sure that he can cover himself. The one X factor, he can talk the elder Adolphus Longstaff into pretty much anything. And he can handle law firms like the Longstaff family's law firm. He can handle them all day long. The one X factor is Dolly Longstaff, who absolutely refuses not to have what's his. He wants his own money. And the X factor that multiplies that is that he's willing to hire a different kind of lawyer. He's willing to hire basically what we would call a 20th century lawyer. Trollope's narrator actually says that Mr. Squarecombe, Dolly Longstaff's lawyer, is a harbinger of a future coming. It's absolutely true. It's the one thing Melmotte's not counting on. But that is great. We will talk about that next week. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.